Business cycles. Economies grow over time. This red line shows us the growth trend line. All economies grow in years. And remember that economic growth is measured by the percentage change in real GDP. In the US economy, the long-run economic growth rate from the 1950s to the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009 was around 3 to 4%. Let's put that here. It's about 3 to 4%, and that is again from the 1950s all the way to the Great Recession years. But after the Great Recession, that growth trend has changed. Now, since the Great Recession, the economy has grown at around 2%, and that is our new trend when it comes to economic growth in the United States. So in our class, when we explain the macroeconomic theory, we will assume that the long-run trend for the US economy is around 2 to 3%. And around that long-run economic growth, economies fluctuate. We see these ups and downs of this economy, and what we see here is a peak where the real GDP is at the maximum, and then real GDP goes down and the economy reaches a trough, and then real GDP starts growing up and we enter an expansionary period, that is the recovery, and the economy reaches another peak. So the time period between the two peaks is called one business cycle. And as we see here once again, around the long run trend, economies sometimes grow and reaches a peak, and sometimes real GDP goes down and declines until it reaches a trough, and then they recover again, reaching another peak. So we see these business cycles all the time. One thing we need to pay attention is that the period from one peak to the trough is called a recession. So how do we define a recession? A recession is a decline in real GDP, for at least 2 consecutive quarters, that is 6 months. If real GDP declines for 6 months, we have a recession. And after we reach a trough, after we hit the bottom, the economy starts recovering. That means real GDP starts growing up, and we enter this recovery period or expansionary period. Let's put that here, expansionary period. And then we reach another peak. So this chart shows us 2 problems associated with business cycle. One is a recession. It is a decline in real GDP, at least for 2 consecutive quarters. And another problem with this business cycle is inflation. So we have this too much spending for too few goods. There's a lot of activity in this economy causing prices to go up. In this class, we will look at first how we define a recession and inflation, and after that we will look at the macroeconomic policies to deal with recessions and inflation. Here we used a business cycle using very smooth lines. We see that the lines are very clear, but in reality we have these business cycles, we have these ups and downs of real gross domestic product, but these ups and downs will not be that clear. Here is the actual ups and downs in the US economy. The blue line is the long run growth rate. So let's put that here. Okay, let's get back to where we were before. So the blue line here is our long run economic growth. This is the potential long run growth trend. And around that long run growth trend, we have these ups and downs. So let me use the red color, just like on the graph. So we see those ups and downs during time. And as we see here, we have sometimes peaks and sometimes troughs. And of course, when we look at 2008 and 2009, this is the Great Recession, we see that decline in real GDP very clearly. And the economy reached a bottom in July 2009, and we see that the economy started to grow. We see that expansionary period until 2020 February. And of course, this graph is from the FRED website. It is our main website, main data source. So let me take you there to show you how we pull up this data. Okay, so this is the FRED website, fred.stlouis.org. I really like this website because you can search any economic data, and most of them are available here. First, I'm gonna search for real gross domestic product. And here we have the chart for the years since the 1950s. And as you see on this chart, we have all these recessions. Each of these gray lines is a recession. The last recession, the current recession is the COVID recession, and before that, the U.S. economy experienced the Great Recession from December 2007 to June 2009, and before that, we had the 2001 dot-com bubble and 1991 recession, and as we go back, we see all other recessions. So this graph shows the short-run fluctuations, just like the downturn in real GDP, for example, during this recession. And here's another downturn in real GDP, and another one here, and the most recent one, the COVID recession, has a big drop in real GDP. I want to add the long run economic trend here. So let's add that. To do that, I want to edit this graph, and I want to edit another line. I just want to type search potential real gross domestic product. All right, it's right here. I want to add this data series, and here we have. All right. So we see that the red line, in this case, the red line shows the potential real GDP, and the blue line shows the actual real GDP. So this information is very important for economists and policymakers to analyze the economy. And of course, this data is very important to understand what kind of macroeconomic policies we need to implement. Now, let's now look at the different recessions and see how deep each recession was, and we can see that information definitely from here. Once again, during the Great Recession, the recession was quite deep, but currently we still don't know if we hit the bottom or if the recession is going to be worse or if the economy will recover soon. So we just need to wait and see. The next question is, I'm going to go back to my slides. The next question is the business cycles in the US history. If we look at a closer look, we see all the recessions from 1857. And this table shows the contraction and also the expansionary periods. And most importantly, when we look at this chart, we see the time period, the duration of the recession. Let me highlight a few things here. For example, when we look at the recession in 1857, the duration of the recession, the contraction, was 18 months. It's right here. It's right here. And if we look at another one here, another deep recession, the contraction was 32 months. Another one that took 65 months. And we see all these contractionary periods that are actually quite deep. And let's find the Great Depression. That is 1929, of course. Let's go to 1929. And here we have 1929. The contraction was 43 months. And you can see why we call it the Great Recession. It was severe. The contraction was severe, and also the duration was really long. It took 43 months. You know, it's so many months. And you know, something happens after the Great Recession, and we see other contractions, other recessions after 1929, of course. But when we compare all these recessions with the ones before the Great Depression, we see that all the recessions after the Great Recession are less severe when it comes to the contraction in real GDP and the duration in months. If you think about that, you know, you might wonder why, you know, since the Great Depression we have less severe recessions. Well, the answer is clear, because a lot of things have changed since the Great Depression. Now we have the methods to measure the economy. The GDP was invented in the 1930s, and GDP now is measured, the economy is measured every quarter. We know how we're doing. And since we know immediately when the economy declines, the policymakers can immediately take some actions to prevent that recession, a severe recession. So what's the difference again? What's the difference between the recessions before the Great Depression and after the Great Depression? Now we have the macroeconomic policy to deal with these economic cycles. Now let's talk about some key facts about economic fluctuations. The first fact is economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. If you look at all these recessions, for example, we have the Great Recession, we have the 2001 recession, 1991 recession, 1981, 1979, 1974-75 recession. When we see all these recessions, and there are more in the previous years, of course, when we look at all these recessions, we do not see a pattern. That means economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. Currently, we are in another recession. We're in 2020, but we don't know when the next recession is going to be. There are, of course, some indicators that tell us about the economy. We can say that, some things are getting wrong, and we can predict some of the economic data, but there's no way to predict the actual economic fluctuations. Another key fact is that macroeconomic variables fluctuate together. Business investments will decline during the recessions, and we see that here. Let me once again mark those changes. Whenever there is a recession, let's start with the current recession, investments are falling. Here is the decline in investments during the Great Recession. And there's also another decline in investments in 2001 recession. So we always see that trend. So investments are volatile. That means during recessions, investments will be affected significantly. And the third key fact is that as output falls, unemployment rises. We definitely see that from our graphs. Once again, we're in 2020 recession. So as the real GDP goes down, the unemployment rate increases. We see that for all the recessions. We see that fact, the unemployment rate is going up in all these recessions. But one thing I want you to pay attention is that the unemployment rate peaks. The unemployment rate peaks after the recession. If we look at all these recessions here, the unemployment starts increasing but peaks even after the recession. And the reason for that is that unemployment rate is a lagging indicator. That means the unemployment rate follows the changes in real GDP. That means there are different types of indicators. In general, we have leading indicators, coincident indicators, and lagging indicators. Leading indicators are the variables that change before real GDP changes. These are the warning signs. If for example, average work week declines, let's say from 38 hours to 34 hours a week, and then we can say that there's something wrong about the economy. If the unemployment claims go up, the weekly unemployment claims, we can tell that there are some things going on in the economy. Again, if new consumers goods orders are declining, if deliveries are being delayed, if new orders for plant and equipment is declining. So, when we look at all these factors like new building permits, stock prices, interest rates, consumer expectations, and business confidence, when we see those changes, we can predict that the economy is not feeling confident, and we may expect some decline in real GDP. But again, there is no way to predict when that will happen. Another set of indicators are called coincident indicators. These are the variables that change at the same time that real GDP changes. Like non-agricultural payrolls. We do not take the agricultural payrolls because the agricultural production is seasonal. So we exclude the agricultural payrolls to focus on the overall activity in the economy. Industrial production and manufacturing and trade sales, those variables also change at the same time real GDP changes. Lagging indicators are the variables that change after real GDP changes, like the unemployment rate. Also, duration of unemployment, consumer price index for services, and commercial and industrial loans are some of the examples for lagging indicators. When we evaluate the economy, GDP is our main indicator. But besides that, there are so many data, there are so many variables that we need to look at when we evaluate the economy. In this class, we will look at the three major macroeconomic indicators. Those are GDP, the unemployment rate, and prices. How do we obtain data about all these economic indicators? There are several sources. These are the ones that I use in my classes and when I look at the economy. So you can go to these websites and look for coincident indicators, lagging indicators, and leading indicators just for practice and see how these economic variables are reported, how they're published, and also how they're used by the economists and our policymakers. One last thing we're going to talk about in this lecture is GDP gap. We need to know and keep track of GDP, and if there is a gap between the actual GDP and the potential GDP, then we need to take some actions. And we have this data. The Bureau of Economic Analysis publishes the GDP data every quarter. Of course, Fred is going to be our friend in this class. Whenever we need data, we can ask Fred. We can search on Fred. And on this chart, once again, we have both the actual GDP, the red line, and also the potential GDP. The difference is the GDP gap. Of course, we want to eliminate this gap because we want the economy to operate at the potential. We want the economy to produce at the potential so that people are employed and the unemployment rate goes down and the standard of living for everyone increases, and we want all of that at stable prices. Once again, let me take you to our website, fred.sanluis.org, to see the data, the interactive data. As we see the output gap here, or the GDP gap, during the recessions, the gap increases. During the expansionary periods, the gap closes down, and finally we reach the long-run growth trend. So what is GDP gap again? GDP gap is the difference between actual GDP, let me put that here again, GDP gap is the difference between actual GDP minus potential GDP. And of course, during the recessions, that actual GDP will be lower than the potential GDP, and therefore the GDP gap will be negative GDP gap for recessions. On the other hand, if the actual GDP is more than the potential, if it's positive, and that GDP gap will be an indicator for inflation. That means there's too much spending in the economy for too few goods. We'll talk about that later. But for the Great Recession period, we can definitely see the GDP gap, which is about $1 trillion. When we look at these numbers between the potential and the actual, from about $15.5 trillion to $16.5 trillion, we see that the gap was about $1 trillion. One last thing, we need to know where that GDP is coming from. This chart is for the Great Recession, and remember the total GDP gap was around $1 trillion. $1 trillion GDP gap. It's about $970 billion. Where did that GDP gap come from? Of course, the Great Recession was due to the real estate market crash, and most of that gap came from the residential investments, a decline in the residential investments. After that, we see that durable goods consumption declined significantly. Another main component of the total GDP gap was private investments, equipment and software, and we see personal consumption expenditures on non-durable goods, and we see the others. So once again, what we're trying to do this week is to analyze the economy using the GDP data, understanding the GDP gap, and also using other macroeconomic indicators such as the leading indicators, coincident indicators, and lagging indicators.